On July 21st, 1993, Dr. Avraham Biran, an Israeli archaeologist, discovered a remarkable stone bearing an inscription written in ancient Aramaic. He had found the first reference outside the Bible to King David and a ruling dynasty, evidence of the House of David.
Raise up a king, one of your own. Call him to lead us, establish his throne. I have chosen a shepherd after my heart, King of my people, my anointed one.
Shalom, hello again. Our programs on King David were inspired by the great find of this wonderful House of David stone by Avraham Biran. You know, the stone is real evidence of David's existence. As we pointed out, David was doubtful in some minds of people that don't believe the Bible, but this is hard evidence. This is a carbon-dated record of a man's existence and of his dynasty. Well, David, you know, tended flocks, though. He was started out as just a shepherd boy, and maybe it was there that he got interested in music. Perhaps as he tended his flocks, he composed songs and poems. The Psalms, of which half at least were written by David, tell a lot about music. Psalm 33 says, "Praise the Lord with harp, and sing unto him with the psaltery and an instrument of 10 strings. Sing unto him a new song. Play skillfully with a loud noise." In trying to find out more about the music and musical instruments of David's time, we first traveled to Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Steve Gear, who is with our ministry, interviews Batya Bayer.
So how is it possible then to take some of the stringed instruments, the organic material that are mentioned in Scripture, and put together what those instruments look like?
We can look at what has been found in the way of depictions, what one calls iconography. I mean, not the instruments themselves, but at least their depictions in sculpture, in engravings, in something that somebody scratched on a potsherd or on a convenient rock face. And we do get an idea. Of course, one has to be careful because not all pictures are photographically exact. And of course, also you've got to know, to take into account the date. You cannot take something from the year 3000 BCE and say that's the instrument King David played on. Neither can you take something Byzantine from the 5th or 6th century of the Christian era. Things change.
So archaeologically, have any of these instruments been uncovered in the desert, preserved?
No. Very good question, that. Because it depends on where you abandon something and what it's made of. Mm-hmm. I mean, clay rattles or cymbals of bronze keep quite well wherever they are. Drums or stringed instruments usually don't keep in the kind of soil that we have here. And if you think about organic materials surviving in caves in the Judean desert, now the problem is that these caves were places where people went to hide themselves in times of trouble. And what do they take with them? Not their musical instruments. I mean, you pack what is necessary. You take your deeds of property to your house, and your shoes, and the lady takes her jewels or whatever, but instruments, no. So unfortunately, this is not what has the kind of thing that has been found until now, where it would have been preserved well.
Based on archaeological artifacts unearthed in Israel, many ancient musical instruments have been reconstructed. Nina Ben-Tzur of the Haifa Museum tells us more.
David was a great warrior, but he also was a poet and a musician. And the musical instruments that he used are all mentioned in the Bible, but we never knew what they looked like because they were never described. And the only clues that we got lately was from the archaeological diggings that were made in the last 3 decades in Israel. On coins, on oil lamps, on frescoes, on reliefs, we find these musical instruments depicted, and we tried to rebuild them, reconstruct them, in fact, according to these archaeological finds. But some of these instruments were actually found in the diggings, especially instruments that are made of pottery or of shells or, for instance, of metal. These materials do not disintegrate in time. So, for instance, these rattles were found in the diggings. This bird, this bottle, this goat, they were found while digging in the different sites. Some symbols were found, for instance, small finger symbols, or the larger ones. And the symbols are mentioned very frequently in the Bible. Because whenever there was a ceremony, a military procession, when they received the kings, when they came back victorious, they went out with cymbals and with drums and with singers to receive the victorious king. Some of them were aerophones, which means wind instruments. For instance, this whistle was made from the wing of a bird. This was found near En Gedi, near the Dead Sea, and it's made of pottery.
There have been many archaeological discoveries that illustrate the musical instruments used in ancient Israel. Nina showed us a map detailing the different locations where some of these items were discovered.
Here we see, for instance, that some of these instruments were found near Haifa, where we are now, the Shikmona drum. This is a figurine. This is from Megiddo, from the ivory carving of Megiddo. This is from the vase of Megiddo. This is the lady from Beit Shean who is holding a lute in her hands. These are the conches that were found far away from the sea with the tip cut so that they can blow them. These trumpets are more in the Jerusalem area because this was in the temple. This was where Bar Kokhba declared his revolt against the Romans, and he put all these instruments on his coins. This, for instance, the incense burner, which we saw in before that, and it was found in Ashdod. And this is the instrument where the mosaic of Gaza of David was found. By the way, these are the remains of a synagogue which was found in Gaza and which belonged to the 5th or 6th century. And I'll tell you a story about this mosaic. When Gaza was captured in 1948, some archaeologists went in, Israeli ones, and they found these remains of the synagogue, and they wrote an article about it, and they said there is a mosaic with the image of David and even his name. So when we left Gaza, all the head was destroyed with the word David and everything. But fortunately, we had a photograph taken before that. So when we came to reconstruct our mosaic, it was according to the photograph, because now the original mosaic is without the upper part of it, all destroyed. The Arabs didn't like the idea that there was a Jewish settlement already in that time, in the 5th and 6th century, in Gaza because they were sure that it was a long time Arab settlement there, and because they didn't like the idea of having David depicted there on one of the mosaics. And we know that this mosaic was not made by a Jewish person because the Jews didn't make any mosaics. It was really more the Christians and more the Byzantine period, because before the Byzantine period we don't find any mosaics anywhere.
One of the instruments used by the Jewish people doesn't need archaeological evidences to prove its existence. This instrument has been used continually since ancient times, the shofar.
The shofar is a sacred instrument to Jews. First of all, it is linked to the sacrifice of Isaac, because as we remember, when the angel said to Abraham, "Don't touch the boy," he lifted up his eyes and he saw a ram entangled in the shrubs. And since that time, the ram's horns became a symbol of a covenant between God and the Jewish people. And this is the most ancient sound that we have from old times, from King David, from before that, till today, because this is the only instrument allowed in the synagogues, even the Orthodox ones.
In the land or in exile, Israel has seemed to always have its problems. The psalmist weeps in Psalm 137, "By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down. Yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. We hanged our harps upon willows in the midst thereof." And their captors ask for songs. In verse 4, "How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget her cunning. If I do not remember thee, let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. If I prefer not Jerusalem above my chief joy." Today, Israel's back in the land, but Jerusalem is in contention. Problems remain. When we return, we'll discuss Israel's present situation, the dilemmas, and Jerusalem with Likud party leader Benjamin Netanyahu.
Well, I was introduced to it through my mother. Actually, she told me to watch Zola on the TV, and I happened to turn it on, and I was really impressed with Zola and what he had to say, and it looked like a really good tour. There were so many great events. The Sea of Galilee, Capernaum, and especially the baptism in the River Jordan was a very emotional time for me and very meaningful.
Tour the Holy Land with Zola Levitt. Call or write for more information.
Mr. Netanyahu, I appreciate you taking the time, and I know you're busy today. Your book, A Place Among the Nations, which I value very much, points out that this taking away pieces of what was intended as a Jewish homeland has been going on for some time.
Only 70 years.
70 years.
Yes. You know, after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, at the end of
1917.
World War I, the nations of the world got together in Versailles and decided which nations would get what and where.
Yes.
And they promulgated the doctrine of self-determination, decided that many countries should now have their independence and their statehood, did so for the countries of Europe, where the Austrian Hungarian Empire had collapsed, decided what to do with the territory, gave the liberty to the Baltic states, which were soon devoured by the Soviet Union until its collapse, and so on and so on and so on. And they decided that preeminent among the nations that should be liberated and given a country of their own should be also the Jewish nation, the Jewish people. And they decided that the minimal thing that should be given the Jewish people is the historic homeland of the land of Israel. What other place could there be for the Jews? Except that they decided that this minimal Jewish home, as they called it, would encompass the present state of Israel, the territories of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, and the present-day state of Jordan.
Even Jordan was included.
Well, they said it's a small country. They said you had, at the time, some 16 million Jews in the world. This was before the Holocaust.
Yes.
And they said, interestingly, before the Holocaust, that after the terrible suffering of the Jews throughout the centuries, remember this is before the Holocaust, before 6 million Jews were slaughtered, and as a result of the lingering Jewish attachment to the Jewish homeland, and as a result of the Jewish contribution to the defeat of the Ottoman Empire, the Jews fought alongside the Allies against the Turks, as opposed to most of the Arabs who were in league with the Turks.
Yes.
As a result of all this, President Woodrow Wilson and Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of England, and Clemenceau, the Premier of France, and so on, Thomas Masaryk, Jan Smuts, the great men of the day, got together and they said, what the minimal thing that we should do is to give the Jewish people a national home in this territory. That didn't last very long, because by 1922, the British, who received the mandate for this national home, lopped off a full 80% of it, the present-day state of Jordan, and gave it to the Arabs. So we were left now with 20%.
First step is they took away 80%.
80% gone, just like that.
Okay.
So now the Jewish people are left with only 20%. And that too was lost in 1947, 1948, when in the War of Independence, when Israel came into being, the present-day state of Israel, when the Arabs occupied the heartland of the Jewish home, Judea and Samaria. That means that today, the Jewish state, having been attacked from these areas of Judea and Samaria in 1967 and reestablished, recaptured it, all that you hear about Israel today is a mere 20% of the original home promised to the Jews. And this original home that we have now, this tiny Israel, which is only 50 miles wide, is itself less than 1/500th of the Arab world. The Arab world is 500 times. The Arabs have 500 times the area of Israel. They have 21 states. They have all the oil in the world, or at least 60% of the oil reserves in the world. And this tiny Israel, which is not even 1%, it's 1/5 of 1%, is being told that's too big.
That's too big too.
You have to make it not 40 miles wide, you have to make it 10 miles or 15 miles wide, and you have to put another Arab state, a 22nd Arab state, in the heart of the Jewish home, promised to the Jewish people, and dominating whatever remains of a truncated and indefensible Israel. That's not justice, but that's what most of the world is asking us to do.
You point out that this is an ancestral homeland. To many Bible-reading people and so on, it's more than that. It's a divine right. It's no other country really has a God-given right to its land except this one, ironically.
Well, I would agree with that, but also look at other countries. France is not in the Bible.
No.
But every Frenchman, if you tell him, why don't you give up the Arc de Triomphe and say a good portion of Paris, he'd jump up and down and say, no way. And if you said to the American people, you said, well, for the sake of peace, to give you an equivalent analogy, why don't you give up the Rocky Mountains to some terrorist organization committed to the destruction of America, and why don't you put in half of Washington, D.C. On your side of the Potomac to boot? You think the American people would go for it? Of course not. In other words, quite apart from the biblical patrimony, there is the natural association of any people to its own homeland. In the case of the Jews, this association goes back to biblical times. It goes back 3,500 years. It's an attachment that has no parallel in the history of nations. No people has fought so long against all the great empires of the world, has lost so much, has been scattered to the four corners of the world, has fought its way back against terrible odds to reestablish itself. No people has expressed this attachment to a particular land as the Jewish people have done to the land of Israel. And now we are told that we have no right to this land. What Woodrow Wilson and what Lloyd George and what all the great statesmen of the world understood 70 years ago as being the natural right of the Jewish people, We are now told, under the weight of successive Arab propaganda that has distorted history, distorted Jewish rights, nullified them by lies and slander, we are now being told, it's not your land. If this isn't our land, if Jerusalem is not my city, if the land of Israel is not my land, where can a Jew live? Where should he live?
It's so clear when you say it. You know, the last time Jerusalem was the capital, King David was on the throne, and I liken it to what we're having today. There was a peace process, so-called. He was trying to control every border. He had internal problems. The land wasn't given away, but he somehow did, by the time of the reign of Solomon, have a peacetime, and the temple was built, and there was a great Jewish nation. It would strike people odd today that Israel once dominated the Middle East and took tribute from surrounding nations and protected them. And I'm wondering if you liken at all this kind of time to a coming messianic period. Some people are starting to say, and there's signs all over Jerusalem, Mashiach is coming and so on.
Well, there are different views on that. I'm not a messianic believer, but I understand that many people view it in those terms. I think that the crucial question is this: whether you are, whether you believe in a divine ordination of events, or whether you believe in the historical rights of the Jewish people, or whether you simply want to see a stable Middle East, it all comes to the same thing, and that is that you must have a strong Israel, and an Israel able to defend itself, and an Israel that is able to live in its ancestral homeland that happens to correspond to the terrain that is needed to protect any Jewish state in the Middle East. So I think that both the champions of genuine peace, as opposed to the peace of jihad that Arafat is offering us, cannot escape the conclusion that Israel must retain its control of the heights of Judea and Samaria, where the Jewish people was crystallized into a nation, but also where the present Jewish state must be in order to defend its very existence and its very life.
Thanks to God in heaven, His love that is everlasting. We give praise to you, Jehovah, for your mercies never ending. You have made us now your people, brought us back from all the nations. You were teaching us in exile how to love you undefiled. May all the people praise you, sing and dance before you, make a joyful noise unto the Lord. King of all the kingdom, creator of creation, author of salvation, on his throne in heaven, we are called to be your people for eternity, your nation. Make a joyful noise unto the Lord. May all the people praise you, sing and dance before you, make a joyful noise unto the Lord. King of all the kingdom, creator of creation, author of salvation, on your throne in heaven, we are called to be your people for eternity, your nation. Make a joyful noise, make a joyful noise, make a joyful noise unto the Lord. Make a joyful noise.
A joyful noise unto the Lord. Marty can really sing some words. That was originally an instrumental on our previous album. My younger son said words could be put to it and sung. I didn't believe it, but there they are. Charlene wrote the words and Marty sang them, and there you have it. And it'll all come on our tape I'll be offering at the end of the program. The Israelis loved music. They played instruments. The Bible is full of that. 2 Samuel 6:5, and David and all the house of Israel played before the Lord on all manner of instruments made of fir wood, even on harps, and on psalteries, and on timbrels, and on cornets, and on cymbals. Their cymbals were a little different than the ones we have now. Could hear them pretty good. And the record of their musical accomplishment is wonderful, at least in the text. We wish we had written pages of music. It's hard to know how they sung the Psalms and so forth from what we have, but they sure did make instruments, and then you saw some of that. There's a poster behind me in the bookcase, which is of a statue of David and his harp and so on, a mosaic from Byzantine days. But it was defaced as a symbol of the Jewish-Muslim struggle, and we told you that story. It seems the Muslims cannot stand the graven images, and they really take it seriously. At Caesarea, they defaced Roman statues that were brought down by the occupying armies of Rome in the first century, just smashing them with hammers and iron bars and spoiling the faces. Statues all over the Middle East, wherever they went, they defaced these wonderful works of art for their own religious reasons. But it wasn't always religious reasons, as the story goes here. It was to destroy the facts, to change history. The Muslim denial of Jewish primacy in the land. If I destroy the statue, who will prove King David ever lived? Which is absurd, of course. Netanyahu's aware of it. That's why we brought him to you. He's really expert on watching the neighbors. He may be the next prime minister, and he's well in command of Muslim habits and their pretenses to the land. Their denial of Jewish prior title is completely crazy. The distance from Abraham to Mohammed is 2,600 years. If we went from now back that far, we'd be before the Greek and Roman empires. The Jews were there long before Mohammed and Islam were ever thought of. Get our tape set, Discovering Our Jewish Roots, and you'll learn it all. $39 for the set, 8 tapes in a beautiful box. You will enjoy it. By 2 of our viewers. Believe me, I learned a lot from it, and so will you. Discovering Our Jewish Roots. Just call the 800 number or get it by mail. Or we're also offering, as I said, the cassette of our music, Faith in the Fire, $12, all the music in this series. Just ask for the Faith in the Fire cassette. And you can get that also at the 800 number or by mailing in. And folks, remember the funds. We're making these programs week by week, and we can surely use the help. And Sha'alu Shalom Yerushalayim. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem.
Raise up a king, we're lost in a world of darkness. Redeem your people. Oh, when will he come? I have given